Part 1. The sky turns against you. The West didn't need gunmen to kill you. It had the sky. 1 minute the plains stretched wide and empty, the horizon sharp as a blade. The next, that same horizon blurred, darkened, and rolled toward you. Like an ocean made of dust, cowboys called it a wall, a curtain, or sometimes just trouble. The official word was sandstorm, but that was too small a word for something that could eat a herd, a town, and the very air out of your lungs. The first warning was the sound. Horses pricked their ears, cattle lifted their heads, and the wind changed from whistle to moan. A cowboy who had seen it before knew the signs: light dimming in the middle of the day, grit beginning to sting against the cheek, and a smell of dry earth sharp enough to taste. Greenhorns often laughed at the first sting of sand until the wall swallowed the horizon, and the world shrank to arm's length. There was no outrunning it. You couldn't ride fast enough to dodge a storm that stretched from horizon to horizon. The smartest move was to dig in, though smart was relative when the sky itself wanted you buried. Cowboys threw saddle blankets over their heads, pulled bandanas tight across mouth and nose, and prayed their horse didn't spook. The cattle almost always did. Stampedes in sandstorms were nightmares carved out of wind. A herd of longhorns could vanish into the yellow haze and return as thunder in every direction at once. Cowboys shouted themselves hoarse trying to turn. The rush, but the wind stole their voices. Some men described it later as fighting ghosts, shapes of cattle appearing a breath away. Eyes wild, then gone again into the blur. For the rider himself, every second became a negotiation with the storm. Sand clawed at skin, filled ears, stung eyes until tears turned to mud on the cheeks. The grit got between teeth so thick you could chew it. A man spat and found his tongue bleeding, not from a wound, but from 1,000 invisible cuts of flying dust. Boots filled with it. Saddlebags too. Later, when the sky cleared, cowboys would shake sand out of their hats like water from a bucket. And then came the fear not of the storm itself, but of losing yourself inside it. When the air turned the color of rust and the world shrank to the length of a horse's neck, direction meant nothing. Men rode in circles, swore they were heading east, only to find the herd they thought they'd lost trampling toward them out of the west. In stories told later, some cowboys swore they heard voices in the storm friends calling their names, mothers, even children. Most of the time, they were alone. The storm had a way of tricking ears, spinning sound until every cry seemed to come from behind. Veteran hands knew the rule: when the horizon disappears, stop moving. Dig in your heels, hunger low, and trust the storm to pass before your wits do. But even veterans could be fooled. The plains stretched so wide that standing still felt like suicide. Men itched to move, to find shelter, to do something. That itch was deadly. More cowboys were lost to wandering in the dust than to the storms. First punch, the animals often chose better. Horses would turn their rumps to the wind, bow their heads, and wait it out. Old hands learned to do the same. Crouch low behind your horse. Let its body take the beating, and hide under its tail like a child under a blanket. It wasn't prideful, but pride didn't matter when the sky tried to erase you. Every storm wrote its own story. Sometimes it lasted minutes, other times half a day. Cattle scattered, cowboys staggered, and when the dust cleared, the world looked rearranged, fences buried, water holes gone, landmarks erased. A man might ride the same trail for 10 years, then wake after one storm and swear the country had shifted under his boots. Maybe it had dot in towns. People ran for cellars, barns, or simply wrapped themselves in quilts and prayed the roof held. Out on the open trail, cowboys had nothing but instinct, grit, and horses. And so they learned. The sky could betray you without a cloud in sight. Blue 1 minute, brown the next. That was the West's cruel joke. And when the dust finally lifted and the sun returned, there was no cheering, only coughing, spitting, and quiet thanks that this time the storm had let them go. Some men laughed afterward, a shaky laugh that came from survival more than humor. Others sat silent, staring at the horizon that had betrayed them, wondering when it would rise up again. Because it always did. Part 2. Shelter of desperation. When the sand came down like rain made of knives, a cowboy's pride didn't mean a thing. Survival wasn't about looking tough. It was about finding something, anything, to put between you and the storm. Out on the plains, where the only wall was the horizon, shelter was whatever you could invent in 30 desperate seconds. The horse was the first answer. Horses knew storms better than men. When the wall of dust hit, they turned their backs to the wind, dropped their heads, and braced. Cowboys learned to do the same. Some crouched low on the lee side, pressing into the animal's flank, using hide and muscle as a living shield. It wasn't dignified, but dignity doesn't keep sand out of your lungs. Old hands said you could always spot the greenhorns. They tried to ride through it, while the veterans crouched under tails and blankets, waiting like foxes in their dens. Blankets and coats became armor. A wool sirop thrown over the head, a saddle. Blanket pulled tight across face and shoulders. Even a slicker doubled and tied shut with a rope. Cowboys wrapped themselves like parcels, sealing every gap with grit already in their teeth. The trick wasn't comfort. There was none. The trick was slowing the storm's teeth just enough to stay breathing, until the sky changed its mind. Some went for the ground itself, a shallow wash, a dry creek bed, even a prairie dog hole, widened with a boot heel. Men dropped flat, pressing their faces into earth, covering heads with hats while the storm shrieked above. Later they'd cough out mud, shake dust from ears, and look like they'd been buried alive. In truth, they had. The storm made everyone half a ghost before it was done. Those with wagons fared a little better. They flipped them, crawled under, or pressed against the wheels. The cook's canvas fly, meant for shade, doubled as a shield if you didn't mind grit pouring through every stitch. In towns, folks dove into root cellars and barns. Out on the open plain, the closest thing to a cellar was a ditch you dug with your bare hands before the dust buried your senses. Cattle knew no rules, and that made them dangerous. Some bunched together, bawling and stamping, a wall of flesh. In the blur, others bolted blind, crushing anything in their path. Cowboys often had to choose: try to hold the herd and risk being trampled, or let them scatter and face the boss's wrath later. Most chose to live and take the wrath. Sandstorms could be rebuilt from, death could not. And then there was silence, not the kind you hear in calm weather, but the smothered silence of a world wrapped in dust. Vision shrank to the space between your hat brim and the horse's ear. Breathing felt like swallowing knives. Cowboys crouched in their makeshift shelters, counting heartbeats, clenching fists, waiting for the sky to tire itself out. Some prayed, aloud, words stolen by the storm before they left their lips. Others muttered curses, promising the land that if it spared them, they'd never gamble away wages again. Promises that almost always broke with the next sunrise. The worst storms were the ones that never seemed to end. Minutes stretched into hours. Men swore they'd grown old crouched under horses, wrapped in blankets that felt like sandpaper. Some tried to walk, convinced the storm was nearly over, only to vanish into the blur and not return. Later, when the sky cleared, their horses were found still braced against the wind, masters gone. The land kept them. So when you hear the old saying, a cowboy's roof was the sky, remember that sometimes the sky turned cruel, and the only roof left was the belly of a horse or a blanket tied tight around a man's fear. Shelter wasn't comfort. Shelter was desperation, pure and simple. Part 3. Madness on the plains. Storm didn't just attack your body, it went for your mind. A cowboy could brace under his horse, wrap in blankets, dig into the dirt, but sooner or later, the wind found its way into his head. Out there, with the horizon gone and the world reduced to swirling grit, a man began to doubt not only his direction, but his own thoughts. The first thing to go was time. Minutes stretched like hours, hours collapsed into seconds. Men swore they'd been crouched half a day, only to rise and find the sun barely shifted. Others thought the storm had lasted no more than a breath, then learned they'd missed whole nights of driving cattle. The sand didn't just blind the eyes, it blinded the clock. Then came the voices. Every old hand had a story of hearing someone call their name inside the storm. Sometimes it was a partner, lost in the blur. Sometimes it was a voice from home, a mother, a child, a sweetheart long dead. The wind twisted sound until it became memory, and memory became a trap. More than one cowboy wandered off chasing a familiar voice, only to vanish later. The herd would find his horse still waiting, reins trailing in the dust. The storm also made liars out of landmarks. Men swore they saw fence lines where none existed, rivers glimmering that turned out to be nothing but waves of sand. Some described figures walking alongside them, other cowboys, silent and steady, who disappeared when touched. Were they ghosts, hallucinations? The storm didn't care. All it wanted was to keep you doubting until you walked in circles long enough to forget. Which way was life? Even those who stayed put felt madness creepin'. Sand hissed like snakes across the ground. Wind moaned through teeth and stirrups until it sounded like laughter. A man wrapped under a blanket might start to believe the storm was whispering to him. Promises, threats, or simply his own fears echoed back. The more exhausted you were, the clearer the whispers grew. Herd animals fared no better. Cattle bawled endlessly, their cries merging into a single low roar that made the ground vibrate. Horses fought their ropes, eyes rolling white. A cowboy trying to hold a string of ponies might feel the madness in their muscles, their panic feeding his own until he had to let go or be dragged blind into the gale. Sometimes men laughed at nothing, tears streaking mud down their cheeks. Sometimes they screamed back at the wind, voices lost in its teeth. And in the middle of it all, the tornado. If the sandstorm was chaos, the tornado was its crown. A spinning tower of black, ripping fences like twigs, lifting wagons as if they weighed no more than cards. Cowboys told of riding blind in the dust, then suddenly hearing a freight train roar above the storm's hiss. The lucky ones dropped flat and clung to dirt. The unlucky swore the funnel lifted the very air from their lungs before tearing off across the prairie. In its wake, silence fell so heavy that men thought they'd gone deaf. When the storm finally passed, the madness didn't leave with it. Cowboys stumbled out half blind, coughing, shaking, not sure which memories belonged to them and which to the storm. Some couldn't stop hearing the whispers days later. Others swore the voices had told them things, secrets, warnings, promises. Few admitted it aloud, but all of them knew. A storm on the plains wasn't just weather. It was a test of the mind, and not every man passed. The West was already hard on sanity. Loneliness, distance, endless horizon. It chipped at the edges of a cowboy's thoughts even on a clear day. Add the storm, and the line between sense and madness blurred quicker than the sky. That's why the old hands said, don't trust the wind. Trust your horse, trust the dirt, but never the wind. Part 4. What the storm leaves behind when the sand finally settled and the wind grew tired of its own fury. The West looked different. A man could ride the same trail 10 years and not recognize it after one storm. Fences disappeared, wells vanished under dunes, wagon tracks turned into shallow graves of dust. The land reshuffled its deck, and you had to learn to play with new cards. The cattle were the first to show the price. Herds scattered like leaves in a gale. Some never found again. 100 head might vanish overnight, driven 20 miles in blind panic. Others choked on the dust, collapsed in hollows, or broke their legs in stampedes no cowboy could stop. Men came back with herds half their size and faces hollow as the animals they drove. The storm didn't just steal beef, it stole pay, pride, and sometimes futures. Horses fared better, but even they bore the storm's mark. Sand scoured their hides raw, clogged their nostrils, and left them trembling at every hiss of wind for days after. Cowboys leaned into them, brushed dust from their manes, and whispered thanks for carrying them through. The bond between man and horse was forged strongest when the sky tried to break them both. For the cowboys, the aftermath was quieter but cruel in its own way. Eyes red, throats raw, lungs heavy with dust that lingered long after the sky cleared. Some men coughed for weeks, others never fully shook the rasp. A few simply rode on with silence in their chests, their voices left behind in the gale. The storm didn't need to kill outright. It planted seeds of weariness that grew slowly, year by year. Towns suffered too, windows blown out, shingles scattered, streets buried ankle deep in sand. Children dug paths from house to house like tunnels in snow, only the snow never melted. Shopkeepers swept for weeks, and still grit rattled under every boot. Churches rang bells muffled by dust, and saloons served whiskey with a crunch of sand. At the bottom of the glass, life went on, but it went on grittier. And then there were the legends, storms that swallowed whole riders, leaving only horses wandering back. Wagons lifted and set down miles away, their cargo lost to time. Cowboys, who vanished in the blur, never found, their names carried on wind like ghost stories. Every campfire had its tales, the man who followed a voice and never returned, the herd that stampeded straight into the storm and was never seen again, the outlaw whose gold disappeared with him into the haze. The West thrived on such stories. They weren't just warnings, they were reminders that no matter how tough your hide or how steady your aim, the land itself had the final word. You could outshoot an outlaw, outride a posse, outsmart a swindler, but you could not outfight the sky when it chose to turn against you. And yet, cowboys kept riding. They tightened their bandanas, checked the horizon, and hoped today the wind stayed a friend. Because that was the bargain freedom came with risk, and risk came with storms. The men who survived didn't boast about beating them. They whispered about enduring them, about hunkering down, about waiting until the sky forgave them enough to ride again. So what did the storm leave behind? Dust in every crack of town, cattle bones bleaching on the prairie, fences bent like toys, and stories, always stories, stories of fear, survival, and madness that made the West less about cowboys and guns, and more about men against a sky that never cared. In the end, the storms gave the West its truest lesson. You don't own the land, you don't even borrow it. You just pass through, hoping the sky lets you, and sometimes when it doesn't, the land remembers your name in the dust.